In this excerpt from The Life Divine, Chapter 25, Sri Aurobindo elaborates at length on the realization of the psychic being and the complete emergence of the soul. The true central being is the soul. But this being stands back, and in most human natures is only the secret witness, or one might say, a constitutional ruler who allows his ministers to rule for him, delegates to them his empire, silently assents to their decisions, and only now and then puts in a word which they can at any moment override and act otherwise. But this is so long as the soul personality put forward by the psychic entity is not yet sufficiently developed. When this is strong enough for the inner entity to impose itself through it, then the soul can come forward and control the nature. It is by the coming forward of this true monarch and his taking up of the reins of government that there can take place a real harmonization of our being and our life. A first condition of the soul's complete emergence is a direct contact in the surface being with the spiritual reality. Because it comes from that, the psychic element in us turns always towards whatever in phenomenal nature seems to belong to a higher reality and can be accepted as its sign and character. At first, it seeks this reality through the good, the true, the beautiful, through all that is pure and fine and high and noble. But although this touch through outer signs and characters can modify and prepare the nature, it cannot entirely or most inwardly and profoundly change it. For such an inmost change, the direct contact with reality itself is indispensable, since nothing else can so deeply touch the foundations of our being and stir it, or cast the nature by its stir into a ferment of transmutation. Mental representations, emotional and dynamic figures have their use and value. Truth, good, and beauty are in themselves primary and potent figures of the reality, and even in their forms as seen by the mind, as felt by the heart, as realized in the life, can be lines of an ascent. But it is in a spiritual substance and being of them and of itself that that which they represent has to come into our experience. The soul may attempt to achieve this contact mainly through the thinking mind as intermediary and instrument. It puts a psychic impression on the intellect and the larger mind of insight and intuitional intelligence and turns them in that direction. At its highest, the thinking mind is drawn always towards the impersonal. In its search, it becomes conscious of a spiritual essence, an impersonal reality which expresses itself in all these outward signs and characters, but is more than any formation or manifesting figure. It feels something of which it becomes intimately and invisibly aware. A supreme truth, a supreme good, a supreme beauty, a supreme purity, a supreme bliss. It bears the increasing touch, less and less impalpable and abstract, more and more spiritually real and concrete, the touch and pressure of an eternity and infinity which is all this that is, and more. There is a pressure from this impersonality that seeks to mold the whole mind into a form of itself. At the same time, the impersonal secret and law of things becomes more and more visible. The mind develops into the mind of the sage, at first the high mental thinker, then the spiritual sage, who has gone beyond the abstractions of thought to the beginnings of a direct experience. As a result, the mind becomes pure, large, tranquil, impersonal. There is a similar tranquilizing influence on the parts of life. But otherwise, the result may remain incomplete. For the mental change leads more naturally towards an inner status and an outer quietude. But, poised in this purifying quietism, not drawn like the vital parts towards a discovery of new life energies, does not press for a full dynamic effect on the nature. A higher endeavor through the mind does not change this balance. For the tendency of the spiritualized mind is to go on upwards, and, since above itself the mind loses its hold on forms, it is into a vast formless and featureless impersonality that it enters. It becomes aware of the unchanging self, the sheer spirit, the pure bareness of an essential existence, the formless infinite, and the nameless absolute. This culmination can be arrived at more directly by tending immediately beyond all forms and figures, beyond all ideas of good or evil or true or false or beautiful or unbeautiful, to that which exceeds all dualities, to the experience of a supreme oneness, infinity, eternity, or other ineffable sublimation of the mind's ultimate and extreme percept of self or spirit. A spiritualized consciousness is achieved, and the life falls quiet. The body ceases to need and to clamor. The soul itself merges into the spiritual silence. But this transformation through the mind does not give us the integral transformation. The psychic transmutation is replaced by a spiritual change on the rare and high summits, but this is not the complete divine dynamization of nature. A second approach made by the soul to the direct contact is through the heart. This is its own, more close and rapid way, because its occult seat is there, just behind, in the heart center, in close contact with the emotional being in us. It is consequently through the emotions that it can act best at the beginning with its native power, with its living force of concrete experience. It is through a love and adoration of the all-beautiful and all-blissful, the all-good, the true, the spiritual reality of love that the approach is made. The aesthetic and emotional parts join together to offer the soul, the life, the whole nature to that which they worship. This approach through adoration can get its full power and impetus only when the mind goes beyond impersonality to the awareness of a supreme personal being. Then all becomes intense, vivid, concrete. The heart's emotion, feeling, spiritualized sense reach their absolute. An entire self-giving becomes possible, imperative. The nascent spiritual man makes his appearance in the emotional nature as the devotee, the bhakta. If, in addition, he becomes directly aware of his soul and its dictates, unites his emotional with his psychic personality, and changes his life and vital parts by purity, God ecstasy, the love of God and men and all creatures into a thing of spiritual beauty, full of divine light and good, he develops into the saint and reaches the highest inner experience and most considerable change of nature proper to this way of approach to the divine being. but for the purpose of an integral transformation, this, too, is not enough. There must be a transmutation of the thinking mind and all the vital and physical parts of the consciousness in their own character. This larger change can be partly attained by adding to the experiences of the heart a consecration of the pragmatic will, which must succeed in carrying with it, for otherwise it cannot be effective, the adhesion of the dynamic vital part, which supports the mental dynamis and is our first instrument of outer action. This consecration of the will in works proceeds by a gradual elimination of the ego will and its motive power of desire. The ego subjects itself to some higher law and finally effaces itself, seems not to exist, or exists only to serve a higher power or a higher truth, or to offer its will and acts to the divine being as an instrument. The law of being and action, or the light of truth which then guides the seeker, may be a clarity or power or principle which he perceives on the highest height of which his mind is capable. Or it may be a truth of the divine will, which he feels present and working within him, or guiding him by a light, or a voice, or a force, or a divine person or presence. In the end, by this way, one arrives at a consciousness in which one feels the force or presence acting within and moving or governing all the actions, and the personal will is entirely surrendered or identified with that greater truth will, truth power, or truth presence. A combination of these three approaches, the approach of the mind, the approach of the will, the approach of the heart, creates a spiritual or psychic condition of the surface being and nature in which there is a larger and more complex openness to the psychic light within us and to the spiritual self, or the Ishvara, to the reality now felt above and enveloping and penetrating us. But for this change to arrive at its widest totality and profound completeness, the consciousness has to shift its center and its static and dynamic position from the surface to the inner being. It is there that we must find the foundation for our thought, life, and action. For to stand outside on our surface and to receive from the inner being and follow its intimations is not a sufficient transformation. One must cease to be the surface personality and become the inner person, the Purusha. But this is difficult. First, because the outer nature opposes the movement and clings to its normal accustomed poise and externalized way of existence, and, in addition, because there is a long way from the surface to the depths in which the psychic entity is veiled from us, and this intervening space is filled with a subliminal nature and nature movements which are not by any means all of them favorable to the completion of the inward movement. The outer nature has to undergo a change of poise, a quieting, a purification and fine mutation of its substance and energy, by which the many obstacles in it rarefy, drop away, or otherwise disappear. It then becomes possible to pass through to the depths of our being, and from the depths so reached, a new consciousness can be formed, both behind the exterior self and in it, joining the depths to the surface. There must grow up within us, or there must manifest a consciousness more and more open to the deeper and the higher being, more and more laid bare to the cosmic self and power and to what comes down from the transcendence, turned to a higher peace, permeable to a greater light, force, and ecstasy, a consciousness that exceeds the small personality and surpasses the limited light and experience of the surface mind, the limited force and aspiration of the normal life consciousness, the obscure and limited responsiveness of the body. Even before the tranquilizing purification of the outer nature has been effected, or before it is sufficient, one can still break down the wall screening our inner being from our outer awareness by a strong force of call and aspiration, a vehement will or violent effort, or an effective discipline or process. But this may be a premature movement, and is not without its serious dangers. In entering within, one may find oneself amidst a chaos of unfamiliar and supernormal experiences to which one has not the key, or a press of subliminal or cosmic forces, subconscient, mental, vital, subtle physical, which may unduly sway or chaotically drive the being, encircle it in a cave of darkness, or keep it wandering in a wilderness of glamour, allure, deception, or push it into an obscure battlefield full of secret and treacherous and misleading or open and violent oppositions. Beings and voices and influences may appear to the inner sense and vision and hearing, claiming to be the divine being or his messengers or powers or godheads of the light or guides of the path to realization, while in truth they are of a very different character. If there is too much egoism in the nature of the seeker, or a strong passion, or an excessive ambition, vanity, or other dominating weakness, or an obscurity of the mind, or a vacillating will, or a weakness of the life force, or an unsteadiness in it, or want of balance, he is likely to be seized on through these deficiencies, and to be frustrated or to deviate, misled from the true way of the inner life, and seeking into false paths, or to be left wandering about in an intermediate chaos of experiences, and fail to find his way out into the true realization. These perils were well known to a past spiritual experience, and they have been met by imposing the necessity of initiation, of discipline, of methods of purification and testing by ordeal, of an entire submission to the directions of the pathfinder or path leader, one who has realized the truth and himself possesses and is able to communicate the light, the experience, a guide who is strong to take by the hand and carry over difficult passages, as well as to instruct and point out the way. But even so, the dangers will be there, and can only be surmounted if there is, or there grows up, a complete sincerity, a will for purity, a readiness for obedience to the truth, for surrender to the highest, a readiness to lose or to subject to a divine yoke the limiting and self-affirming ego. These things are the sign that the true will for realization, for conversion of the consciousness, for transformation is there. The necessary stage of the evolution has been reached. In that condition, the defects of nature, which belong to the human being, cannot be a permanent obstacle to the change from the mental to the spiritual status. The process may never be entirely easy, but the way will have been made open and practicable. One effective way often used to facilitate this entry into the inner self is the separation of the Purusha, the conscious being, from the Prakriti, the formulated nature. If one stands back from the mind and its activities, so that they fall silent at will, or go on as a surface movement of which one is the detached and disinterested witness, it becomes possible eventually to realize oneself as the inner self of mind, the true and pure mental being, the Purusha. By similarly standing back from the life activities, it is possible to realize oneself as the inner self of life, the true and pure vital being, the Purusha. There is even a self of body, of which, by standing back from the body and its demands and activities, and entering into a silence of the physical consciousness, watching the action of its energy, it is possible to become aware, a true and pure physical being, the Purusha. So, too, by standing back from all these activities of nature successively or together, it becomes possible to realize one's inner being as the silent, impersonal self, the witness Purusha. This will lead to a spiritual realization and liberation, but will not necessarily bring about a transformation. For the Purusha, satisfied to be free in himself, may leave the nature, the Prakriti, to exhaust its accumulated impetus by an unsupported action, a mechanical continuance not renewed and reinforced or vivified and prolonged by his consent, and use this rejection as a means of withdrawing from all nature. The Purusha has to become not only the witness, but the knower and source, the master of all the thought and action, and this can only be partially done so long as one remains on the mental level, or has to still use the ordinary instrumentation of mind, life, and body. A certain mastery can indeed be achieved, but mastery is not transformation. The change made by it cannot be sufficient to be integral. For that, it is essential to get back, beyond mind being, life being, body being, still more deeply inward to the psychic entity inmost and profoundest within us, or else to open to the superconscient highest domains. For this penetration into the luminous crypt of the soul, one has to get through all the intervening vital stuff to the psychic center within us, however long, tedious, or difficult may be the process. The method of detachment from the insistence of all mental and vital and physical claims and calls and impulsions, a concentration in the heart, austerity, self-purification and the rejection of the old mind movements and life movements, rejection of the ego of desire, rejection of false needs and false habits, are all useful aids to this difficult passage. But the strongest, most central way is to found all such or other methods on a self-offering and surrender of ourselves and of our parts of nature to the Divine Being, the Ishvara. A strict obedience to the wise and intuitive leading of a guide is also normal and necessary for all but a few specially gifted seekers. As the crust of the outer nature cracks, as the walls of inner separation break down, the inner light gets through, the inner fire burns in the heart. The substance of the nature and the stuff of consciousness refine to a greater subtlety and purity, and the deeper psychic experiences, those which are not solely of an inner mental or inner vital character, become possible in this subtler, purer, finer substance. The soul begins to unveil itself. The psychic personality reaches its full stature. The soul, the psychic entity, then manifests itself as the central being, which upholds mind and life and body, and supports all the other powers and functions of the spirit. It takes up its greater function as the guide and ruler of the nature. A guidance, a governance begins, from within which exposes every movement to the light of truth, repels what is false, obscure, opposed to the divine realization. Every region of the being, every nook and corner of it, every movement, formation, direction, inclination of thought, will, emotion, sensation, action, reaction, motive, disposition, propensity, desire, habit of the conscious or subconscious physical, even the most concealed, camouflaged, mute, recondite, is lighted up with the unerring psychic light, their confusions dissipated, their tangles disentangled, their obscurities, deceptions, self-deceptions precisely indicated and removed. All is purified, set right, the whole nature harmonized, modulated in the psychic key, put in spiritual order. This process may be rapid or tardy, according to the amount of obscurity and resistance still left in the nature, but it goes on unfalteringly so long as it is not complete. As a final result, the whole conscious being is made perfectly apt for spiritual experience of every kind, turned toward spiritual truth of thought, feeling, sense, action, tuned to the right responses, delivered from the darkness and stubbornness of the tamasic inertia, the turbidities and turbulences and impurities of the rajasic passion and restless unharmonized kinetism, the enlightened rigidities and sattvic limitations or poised balancements of constructed equilibrium, which are the character of the ignorance. This is the first result. But the second is a free inflow of all kinds of spiritual experience, experience of the self, experience of the Ishvara and the divine Shakti, experience of cosmic consciousness, a direct touch with cosmic forces and with the occult movements of universal nature, a psychic sympathy and unity and intercommunication, and interchanges of all kinds with other beings and with nature, illuminations of the mind by knowledge, illuminations of the heart by love and devotion and spiritual joy and ecstasy, illuminations of the sense and the body by higher experience, illuminations of dynamic action in the truth and largeness of a purified mind and heart and soul, the certitudes of the divine light and guidance, the joy and power of the divine force working in the will and the conduct. These experiences are the result of an opening outward of the inner and inmost being and nature, for then there comes into play the soul's power of unerring inherent consciousness, its vision, its touch on things, which is superior to any mental cognition. There is there, native to the psychic consciousness in its pure working, an immediate sense of the world and its beings, a direct inner contact with them, and a direct contact with the self and with the divine, a direct knowledge, a direct sight of truth and of all truths, a direct, penetrating spiritual emotion and feeling, a direct intuition of right will and right action, a power to rule and to create an order of the being not by the gropings of the superficial self, but from within, from the inner truth of self and things and the occult realities of nature. Some of these experiences can come by an opening of the inner mental and vital being, the inner and larger and subtler mind and heart and life within us, without any full emergence of the soul, the psychic entity, since there, too, there is a power of direct contact of consciousness. But the experience might then be of a mixed character, for there could be an emergence not only of the subliminal knowledge, but of the subliminal ignorance, an insufficient expansion of the being, a limitation by mental idea, by narrow and selective emotion, or by the form of the temperament, so that there would be only an imperfect self-creation and action, and not the free soul emergence, could easily occur. In the absence of any or of a complete psychic emergence, experiences of certain kinds, experiences of a greater knowledge and force, a surpassing of the ordinary limits, might lead to a magnified ego, and even bring about, instead of an outflowering of what is divine or spiritual, an uprush of the titanic or demonic, or might call in agencies and powers which, though not of this disastrous type, are of a powerful but inferior cosmic character. But the rule and guidance of the soul brings into all experience the tendency of light, of integration, of harmony and intimate rightness, which is native to the psychic essence. A psychic, or, more widely speaking, a psycho-spiritual transformation of this kind would be already a vast change of our mental human nature.